if I give you a sort of a very brief potted history of how we came about and how we got to where we got to, really, which might be helpful and sort of illustrate some of the issues, I suppose, as we go. So this is going back, if you cast your mind back to sort of that pre-COVID era when we used to be able to go out and talk to each other and meet and things like that. So it's about, it's probably what, 2.5 years ago now, I suppose. I was, at that point, I was sort of getting really quite frustrated. I suppose we were at a period in time when, we were approaching a decade of a government that didn't really seem to be doing much in the way of addressing a lot of the, what a lot of us might think as sort of key social challenges, and getting frustrated. I was anyway with the sort of political process and the fact that we weren't really seeing any sort of practical changes happening. And I come from a background in the cooperative movement where you sort of you come together and you do stuff and you make stuff happen. So I was talking to some people about this, about the idea of trying to do something locally, really. And we weren't, at that point, we weren't thinking about social care as the thing that we were going to get stuck into. It was more general than that. But we got a series of meetings together with, I don't know, maybe a dozen people involved, something like that, and talking about what we might be able to achieve, what we might be able to do within our sort of local context, within our part of Kirklees. So we're in the Kirklees local authority area here, and it's quite a mixed area. You've got the sort of, I suppose, we're sort of in the sort of relatively affluent southern end of the borough, I suppose, and then you've got sort of Huddersfield and Dewsbury are the two major sort of urban bits of it, heading up towards Leeds. So we were looking at a number of issues, and we came very close to trying to do something in and around problems with food and access to healthy food. And about 10 years ago, I was involved in the sort of community buyout of a local greengrocery business, which is now thriving as a sort of community-owned organisation. So we were looking around issues around that, but we also started talking about social care and the problems there. And I think what we quickly came to agree on in those conversations is that it's an issue that touches everyone's lives, and it was really quite topical at the time, I suppose, and still is today, obviously, because of the pandemic and everything that's happened since. But so we sort of said, okay, well, there's these sort of major challenges in social care. We can see that as consumers, as ordinary people in the street, we can see that what's happening isn't really working for people like us. It doesn't appear to be working for people who work in the care industry because they're all poorly paid and undervalued. And so we thought, okay, well, let's try and do something. Let's see if a different approach here could have an impact. And so we thought, okay, looking at it from sort of first principles and from our, I suppose, our sort of shared values and our political perspective, the obvious solution seemed to be to try and develop something that was owned by and accountable to the community that it served. But we also wanted to ensure that the people who worked in care, who were involved in anything that we might set up, had a real stake in it. So it was sort of what fell out of that really quite quickly was the idea of this sort of multi-stakeholder cooperative care organisation that would be locally rooted, locally owned and controlled, and responsive to the people who were in receipt of care, who would also be co-owners in the enterprise, and and the people who worked in the operation, who would also have an ownership stake in the business. So there'd be employee owners as well. And our colleague Richard, who's a local councillor, who was part of that founding group, unfortunately he's no longer involved, but part of that founding group, and he took it upon himself to sort of write this thing up in a short paper, and he stuck it under the nose of some of the senior officers in the local authority and said, here, have a look at this. And him being a councillor, of course they had to read it. And I think that, certainly speaking for myself, we were really surprised at their response, which was one of great enthusiasm and very active support, which continues to this day. You know, with the benefit of hindsight, we now know that they've been struggling with many of the same sorts of issues, obviously from their perspective, which is a totally different perspective as commissioners of services and planners, and you know, trying to make the numbers stack up from their end, and struggling with exactly the same sorts of challenges that we could see from our end as consumers. And that sort of gave us the spur really that we needed at that point to try and move forward and do something for real. And we get so what we identified a little bit of seed money from the Power to Change Trust. They operate a scheme, an occasional scheme called the Bright Ideas Fund, where if you've got a sort of a vague idea for a community business or something like that, you can get some money from them to help you develop that and plan it and take it forward. So we applied for that and were successful, and they gave us, I can't remember exactly how much it was, about £15,000 or something, to help us do some work to take the ideas forward. And then the local authority in Kirklees then launched a grant fund, which was designed, really looking at it, it was designed to support very small scale local social activities. So it might be that, you know, looking at the application form, I remember it now, it was sort of saying, you know, the implication was, well, if you wanted to apply for a sort of £300 grant to run some local activities or something like that, they'd support that sort of thing. And that's what it was designed for. But this grant fund had a ceiling of I can't remember what it was, £50,000. And so we said, okay, well, let's apply for this fund and apply for the maximum amount, and you know, and see what happens. And we were successful. So that gave us the resource that we needed to really drive the idea forward and plan seriously to try and create something. So we were able to, you know, bring in a little bit of sort of consultancy help and really get the ball rolling. And then obviously COVID happened, so everything slowed down, but at the same time everything sped up, and it was all really weird, and it still is. But so then when we were able to secure support from the local authority by way of some seconded expertise, so we've been extremely fortunate to have access to a local authority registered manager who's helped us sort of develop the business and put all our sort of policy frameworks in place, and do a huge amount of sort of heavy lifting that you need when you're starting this sort of business, and got us through the CQC registration process and all of that work. And although we've been quite significantly delayed from our sort of original timeline, we're now at a point where we're on the verge now of having staff and a registered manager and customers, and it's all coming together. And there's still an enormous amount to do, obviously, We're still learning at a phenomenal pace, but it feels like it's all sort of falling into place, albeit a little bit behind schedule. A couple of other things I just want to mention very briefly before we move on was right back in the beginning, we went to meet with a guy called Simon Duffy, who runs a thing in Sheffield called the Centre for Welfare Reform. And the thing that I remember, we spent the day with him, and the thing I remember from that conversation was a really valuable insight, I thought, which was about how difficult it is for local authorities, especially when they're operating at such a large scale, to be able to manage any sort of effective social care commissioning support process when they're dealing with so many people. Despite the best will in the world, they're looking at such large numbers that they end up dealing with the numbers rather than the people. And I thought that was a really valuable insight. So part of that sort of translated through into our thinking about how important it was that we were small enough to be able to deal with people at a human level, and that the organization was small enough so that ordinary people could seriously run the thing, and we wouldn't have to draft in heavyweight accountants or business managers, that we could do it as sort of reasonably bright, reasonably well educated bunch of ordinary folks could actually run this thing. And that's been a sort of an abiding principle and continues to be. I think that's all I wanted to say, really. So